Right, just 11 days now to go to the presidential election. But of course, we're also voting in a referendum on that day, which is really only now being debated and discussed. What are we voting on? Well, we're voting on the removal of the offence of blasphemy that is currently in the Irish Constitution. And I suppose quite worryingly at this stage, or maybe not, surveys have shown that almost a third of all voters don't yet know which way they're going to vote in that referendum. The word blasphemous appears in Article 46.1 of the Constitution, which reads, "The publication or utterance of blasphemous, seditious or indecent matter is an offence which shall be punishable in accordance with the law." If the referendum is passed, it will remove the word blasphemous. And technically, apparently you can be heavily fined for the crime of blasphemy in this country, although it's a very, very rare occurrence. We're joined on the line now, and hopefully our next debate will help you make up your mind ahead of the referendum vote on Friday week. Tim Jackson from Donegal, former general election candidate, who wants no change to the law. He's of the Believe in Respect group. And John Hamill from Atheist Ireland, who's pushing for yes vote. We've talked to John on the programme before. Tim and John, good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. Tim, why no change? Why do you see...
No change, because the authors of the Constitution were incredibly wise in inserting this clause, which simply guarantees respectful discourse around what's sometimes a very important matter for people. And that respectful discourse is what guarantees civilised debate. And so the legislation is crafted in such a way that it's incredibly difficult to actually prosecute someone, which is why there hasn't been one prosecution in 163 years.
But they can be prosecuted, Tim. That's the question. It is on the statute book. So why?
Because the effect of the clause is obviously to do with the education of public morality, and that it is crafted in such a way that it promotes civilised debate and ensures that people are able to express any and all ideas, but have to do so in a respectful manner, which I think most people will agree is a correct way to approach these topics. And so this isn't really about freedom of speech, because if it was, you would see the government trying to remove the clauses on indecent and seditious matter. This is more really a government exercise which is costing millions of euros to the taxpayer.
Okay, so is it the cost you object to, or what we're actually voting on, and the issue of freedom of speech? You're saying it's not relevant in this case.
Well, I think most people will agree freedom of speech is not an absolute right. No one has the right to call for the death of innocent people, for example, or for certain minorities to be targeted. And all this does is ensure that no religious minority or majority, for that case, is grossly abused when discussing matters that they hold dear.
Okay, so do you see this? Do you see this as an attack on all those who have a faith, who have a religion?
Well, as Senator Niall McDowell, who isn't gospel greedy, shall we say, has already acknowledged in the Senate that it could lead to open season on people's beliefs, and so this is just about respectful debate. That's simply it. John,
it's all about respect at the end of the day. And what's so terribly wrong with that? Respecting people.
I would have a much higher opinion of religious people in Ireland than Tim seems to have. So my experience of religious people in Ireland is that they are not wilting snowflakes. They are very capable of having an adult and mature conversation without calling the Gardaí when they hear something that they don't like. So I'm friendly with Father Joe MacDonald in Ballyfermot. Now I have great respect for Father Joe. He's a wonderful man. And I've often said highly blasphemous things when I'm talking to Father Joe about his God. Father Joe does not clutch his pearls and look around for a fainting couch. He does not try to haul me in front of the High Court and impose a €25,000 fine on me.
Yeah, but you don't expect that to be the case, surely.
No, what I expect from Father Joe is what I get. He very quickly tells me where he thinks I'm wrong, and he explains where he thinks he's right. And I think most religious people in Ireland are strong in their faith like Father Joe, and they're perfectly capable of having an adult conversation without demanding help from the Gardaí.
Okay, but you obviously have respect for your friend Father Joe. And what's so terribly wrong with the law as it stands? Because the law as it stands surely encourages respect for people and their beliefs, their religious beliefs.
There's a distinction between Father Joe as a person and the ideas that Father Joe believes in. And I certainly think we should have respect for all people, but it should be permissible to criticise ideas. So a good rule of thumb in this area is that no person should be beneath respect, but no idea should be above criticism. And I agree with Tim in terms of the free speech argument. I'm not a free speech absolutist, and there is speech that qualifies as incitement to religious hatred, which would still be illegal in Ireland if we repeal the blasphemy law. So incitement to religious hatred is a law that we have that protects people from being attacked. The blasphemy law protects ideas from criticism, and I think no person should be beneath respect, but no idea should be above criticism.
Okay. Tim, the separation of church and state, that's something that John and Atheist Ireland have talked about during this campaign. Isn't it time that we continue to move to separate both?
And just on John's point, I would say no idea is beyond criticism, even with this clause, which I think is quite obvious when you read through any opinion pieces in newspapers from week to week. So the blasphemy clause is simply about doing so in a respectful manner, that's all. Your ideas are still very valid and can be presented to the public. But in terms of separation of church and state, I think you need to go back again to the authors of the Constitution and their vision for the Republic. And that is that they were quite aware, as people who were incredibly learned and well-trained in philosophy, that there had to be a substantial foundation for human rights in the Constitution, and that foundation cannot or should not be egregiously undermined. And so the only solid foundation, and something that secularists tend to struggle with, is finding something that where human rights will be objective and cannot be altered by government. And that is ultimately that we're made in the image and likeness of God. And so if government is suddenly the arbiter of all that is right and wrong, it can take and give rights at its will, which again is something that philosophers have argued about for centuries, millennia in fact. And so it's important that people realise that by voting out the blasphemy clause, we're actually cutting off the branch in which we sit, because your fundamental rights, as the Constitution acknowledges, are inalienable and imprescriptible and antecedent to all governmental law. And this is incredibly important, because what we're doing if we vote this out is undermining the foundations of the Constitution, which the patriots and the authors of our Constitution fought so hard to build.
Okay. John, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think Tim's right that philosophers have debated since time immemorial about whether or not gods exist, and neither Tim nor I can prove our position. So I can't prove that God doesn't exist, and Tim can't prove that God does exist. But what our Constitution does is that it picks a side. It says that not only does God exist, but actually God exists, and he is so delicate that he needs the High Court in Dublin to protect his rights. It says that God exists, and that if anyone in Ireland says anything mean about him, we must drag that person in front of the High Court and fine €25,000.
Okay, but the fact remains, whether you accept it or not, that in the most recent census, 85% of people in this country marked the box expressing themselves as being a member of one religion or another. 85%. If we change the law, is that not a direct attack on those people and what they believe in, John?
Well, many of those people who tick the religious box are religious minorities, and religious minorities are the primary victims of blasphemy laws. So, for example, there's a Christian lady called Asia Bibi who is on death row in Pakistan at the minute, waiting to be executed for blasphemy. And when Atheist Ireland launched our campaign, we provided an open letter from 24 other victims of blasphemy laws who are asking Ireland to remove our law as part of their efforts to remove the blasphemy laws in more repressive countries. So I don't think we should turn our backs on Christians like Asia Bibi or other religious minorities who have asked for our help. We shouldn't tell those people that blasphemy laws are acceptable. We shouldn't be part of the religious mobs seeking to persecute religious minorities. We should stand up to the mobs.
Okay, all right. Well, so we need to send out a signal. Not only are we voting to change our own constitution, we need to send out a signal, you're saying. Do you agree with that or not, Tim?
Well, I'm delighted to hear about the work John and others have been doing for those in Pakistan, for example, who are oppressed by the blasphemy laws there. But I would say there's a fundamental difference between their laws and ours, in that in countries like that, you're not even allowed to express the ideas, whereas here you are, and there is no threat of prosecution for people who do so in a way that isn't grossly abusive. So as long as you present your ideas in a respectful way, you're perfectly entitled to, and the legislation is very clear on that matter. It's the 2009 Defamation Act. And so I would say that this is simply about ensuring civilised debate so that everyone can present their ideas and no one is shut down and no one is left to feel on the margins of society, because our laws are fundamentally different, and thankfully so. So I would say that people really have to consider this matter very deeply, because it's one that concerns a number of different levels of the Constitution. First, as I've said, about peaceful and civilised debate, but also about the foundations, which are slowly but surely over the decades been deconstructed in the Constitution. All
right, just a final question, and it was Tim who mentioned it, and it is a relevant issue, John. €3 million, it's estimated, this referendum will cost the state. Is it value for money or not, do you think, John?
It certainly is. So if we want to have legislation in this country that keeps pace with human rights standards, then democracy costs money, so we should expect to pay for that. And I think it'll have real benefits for the country if we can remove this blasphemy law. So, for example, in the introduction to this debate, you mentioned the comments by the Pope that blamed the devil for child abuse scandals in the church. Now, anyone who reads the Gospels will quickly realise that Jesus performs an exorcism on almost every page. During his ministry, Jesus does few things more than casting out demons. And I could tell you exactly what I think about Jesus and all of those silly stories about evil spirits and demonic possession. But I think our discussion on topics like this would be more open and useful if they weren't constrained by blasphemy laws.
All right. Well,
can I just make one last point?
Blame awful crimes on evil spirits, but Irish people are constrained in what and how we can respond to that.
Can I just make one last point, Niall?
Well, I wanted to ask you about the cost, but what did you want to say?
Well, firstly, on the cost, I think most people would agree it would be better to spend on the crisis around homelessness, for example. But anyway, I think that John's contribution, just calling certain passages of the Gospel silly, is a perfect example of the distinction between our laws and the Pakistani laws. Because in Pakistan, if you said that in public radio, you would go to jail and perhaps be sentenced to death. Here, John's perfectly entitled to come on the radio and express his opinion. And so I think that's a perfect example to everyone listening, that these laws really haven't got any impact on people's day-to-day conversations or public discourse, aside from when, as the legislation states, the conversation becomes grossly abusive or inflammatory. All
right, okay. Thanks to both of you for coming on. Tim Jackson of the Believe in Respect group from Donegal. Thanks to John Hamill of Atheist Ireland as well.